Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. All the people in the back also take your seats. I still have to say that in case of fire, there are 4 fire escapes. 2 at the back. I feel like an airplane stewardess. 2 at the back and 2 at the rear. But welcome back. I think everybody's now really fired up. We'd had 2 days already, side events, and then yesterday and now this morning I saw a lot of activity going on, also after the plenary on education. But now we're going to talk about something that I have to confess I can only ask the dumb blonde questions. Labor markets. Labor markets. Everybody has been reiterating over the last 48 hours that we need to create the equivalent of about 40 million decent jobs. And I say decent jobs, not just jobs, 40 million decent jobs to meet the estimated demands for good health in the world. So 40 million, that's quite a lot. So this morning we talked about what do we need in terms of education. And a lot of people said on the panel that we had, said, well, education is a little bit also a slow system. We need to diversify, we need to do all kinds of things to meet the demands of our populations. Now we're going to talk about labor markets. Now, if anything is complex, it's labor markets. And I know because I used to live next door to an economist, and he was talking about it all the time. And this guy made it even more complex than we are going to make it today. Fortunately, we have 4 extremely good panelists, and now I'm going to climb on stage, but before I'm going to invite them up, we're going to do the quick round again. Who in this room says, with dry eyes, I can call myself a labor market specialist? With dry eyes. I see one woman, she said, I am. I have to walk to her because she was so jumping up. You should have been on the panel. This is what you're thinking. You're really dry-eyed labor market specialist. What are you doing?
Hi. Well, I'm not a health person, so I'm so happy to be asked for my specialization. I work at FHI 360, a nonprofit organization, and I'm a labor market economist.
Labor market economist, non-health person. Are there more people of that sort of species? Non-health people. Non-health people with labor markets. I saw a few more hands. Anybody else who says, I'm with dry eyes, I can say I'm a labor market specialist? You look like you might be one. It's maybe I'm mistaken by the moustache and the wisdom that this gentleman expresses. Anybody else, labor market specialist? Who says, you know, for me, especially not after lunch, you know, it's really complex, labor market. I find labor markets complex. Who says I find labor markets complex? See, the specialist is also saying she finds it complex. You also find it complex. So a lot of you are actually here also to learn a little bit. Now, we're going to talk about labor markets and health labor markets. There's also 2 things, but it might be a little bit the same. So I'm going to invite up, in a minute, 4 people that will actually help you to think more straightly about labor markets. Okay, so we're not going to just do some sort of economics labor market course 101. We're actually going to talk about optimizing labor markets, because we feel this gap at the 40 million jobs, decent jobs that need to somehow be created, it has to come from somewhere. So the 4 people that we have invited to speak in this panel, and I'm very, very happy to introduce them, is first of all a countryman of mine. I can't help it. Normally it's ladies first, but this gentleman is from my country. Mr. Tjitte Alkema. Can we have an applause for him? Mr. Tjitte Alkema is from HOSPEEM, and that is actually a very important organization that is an employers organization for hospitals, and he deals a lot with labor markets. I think if I can point you, maybe you could sit on that side, would that be all right? The second chair? we're going to do a gender balance. The organization has had a lot of issues with gender balance, so we'll have the gender balance on this podium. Now, a second guest, and I'm very, very honored and pleased that she's also here. We heard already earlier days a lot from her. It's Miss Miatta, I have to pronounce your name rightly, Gbanya. I can't do this glottal stop that we need to do. But Miss Miatta, big applause for her. You can sit at the front. She's working for the Ministry of Health of Liberia, and she has a long career in, let's say, reconstruction of health systems. You've worked under very challenging circumstances. The crisis in Liberia first, 2008, the pool fund was actually constructed, and she became the person for the last 4 years that has been actually coordinating that pool fund. We know that Liberia was also subject to the Ebola crisis. And so crisis upon crisis, but the country is very resilient, and they have built and rebuilt and used the crisis also for radical rethink. And so we're going to talk with you about labor market, because one of the points that you submitted earlier was a crisis can sometimes also be an opportunity to think through challenging configurations like of labor markets. Now, our next guest is Mr. Oliver Liang. He's actually from ILO, and I don't know where he's sitting, Oliver. You can now come up the stage. I see he's still studying his... He submitted 5 pages with points. I said, we're not going to do those. But we're going to treat all of them in a conversation. So, Oliver, very, very welcome. On behalf of everybody, we know that ILO is also very much implicated in this shared agenda. So, if you could sit next to me on the other side. The ILO, of course, looks at labor markets from many, many different perspectives, and I think we will hear a lot of them. And very happy probably for the expert in the back, because labor market also treated from a non-health perspective. We're going to focus on labor markets in health, but very much also the broader perspectives. And now finally, last but not least, Professor Debra Thoms, First Assistant Secretary of Aging and Aged Care Services, the Ministry of Health of Australia, Chief Nursing Officer. And we already heard of her also a little bit in earlier panels, but very, very happy, Debra, that you're here. So if you could sit here, I think, now this looks like a good photo, gender-balanced setup, huh? As far as we can. All right, applause for that, because this is a long talk. All right, now, without further ado, because we said after a whole day of being together, we can now start to normally talk to each other. We had panels, like more official ones. But here we have a panel where we're going to seriously tackle some of the complexities of this topic. Why should we talk, Debra, why should we talk about labor markets anyway? What is the importance in light of the subject of human resources and health? Why should we talk about labor markets? What kind of talk should we have about labor markets?
Thank you, and it's my pleasure to be here today. And I do not profess to be a labour market expert, but I think that we cannot ignore the relationship between the labour market and our capacity to provide health services, and the relationship that the provision of health services play to the greater economy of communities and countries more generally. So that it's not that we look at these things in isolation, but we need to understand the complexity and interrelationships between the various markets that exist within economies.
Do you feel comfortable in a discussion about labour markets?
Not entirely, no. It's not, as I say, I'm not an expert.
So, but you see its importance. At
Yes.
the same time, you say it is complex.
Yeah.
Now, I've learned, in my life that when you say the word complex, normally very little things move. It's sort of like, once we say complex, we know we can talk a lot, but, how do we drive something? So, do you feel a serious discussion about labour markets actually helps to change anything?
I think it can, and I think that while we might talk about, numbers of jobs we need, and we don't know what the exact number might be, it raises a flag for us that we need to make change. We cannot continue to do things the way we have done because we won't be able to meet the demands for healthcare, and the labour market is part of the answer to how we address some of those issues. So I think it's of critical importance that we try to understand it and that we do engage in conversation. And as we talk and share and learn from each other, well, then hopefully we might find some solutions for our own particular problems.
Okay. We come to the Australian case very soon, but I first want to move to my right side here. Mr. Alkema, you are actually for quite some time involved with the hospital sector in Europe. So you're in the European organization. Hospital management is an employer group, so they are in labor markets one way or the other. Now, when you hear the topic, especially in the global arena, because you have been focusing very much on the European case, but for you, the discussion about labor markets in a global arena, does that make sense, or do we need to stay everybody in their own country?
I think there's a very interesting angle to labor markets and healthcare. That's a global issue. There is a recent study by the OECD that focuses on why we ever created hospitals, and this happened around a century ago when X-rays and anesthesia became available. And to provide our population with these new healthcare initiatives, we had to create institutions. And what we see currently happening, and this is not just happening in OECD countries, but also in other countries of the world, is that healthcare provision is moving out of the hospital setting. It's moving to the patient at home. Just one example, why should you ask a patient with COPD to come to a hospital where a better care can be delivered at the patient's home? And this is not just a European perspective, but this is happening everywhere in the world. So, and our labor market really has to adopt to these fundamental shifts in provision of healthcare. And it's not easy. I'm glad that there is at least one labor market specialist in the room. As a new species, as I've heard, but it's really a complex issue, and we can learn from the past, but we cannot find solutions for the future by only looking at the past. We have to become very much more innovative in our approaches.
We agreed in advance we would talk a little bit informally, so I can call Mr. Oliver. Now, Oliver, you're working for the ILO, and we know the ILO is extremely busy with labor markets, generally. Now, of the long list of perspectives that you have thrown at the subject, in the context of what we're talking about here, the concrete challenge to get 40 million jobs by the year 2030, get them organized. What would you emphasize in labor market dynamics as you currently view it in your organization?
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I would say, first of all, it's beyond just a labor market issue. Health workers are not just a market force. It's not just supply and demand, of course. It's something about societies determining what priorities they have in reaching the SDGs, in this case, SDG 3. It's a labor issue, and as we know, labor is changing enormously. You have technology coming in, artificial intelligence, you have different employment relations, you have a lot of young people looking for work, you have deteriorating unions, for example, that are representing people. So the world of work is very different today and will be very different in the next 10, 20 years than it is today. So I think these are the kinds of things we have to anticipate if we want to motivate and attract people into the health workforce. So yes, there is a market issue. We have to improve supply. Yes, we have to make sure that that supply matches demand. But I think we have to kind of think outside of these dynamics a bit and start thinking about how to motivate and what priorities we're setting as society.
I'm immediately turning to the radical rethink corner here. Miatta, when you hear this, I mean, when you were confronted with a health system where you had to actually, I wouldn't say start from scratch, because of course there were a lot of people there, but where you were forced a little bit to do the radical rethink, were you taking on this kind of dynamic thinking, say, well, the world will be a very different place 20 years from now, 10 years from now, so let's use this opportunity to leapfrog, you know, to sort of maybe move. Did you do that?
Yeah, I guess the first thing to mention is that because the issue of the labor market is complex, it's every reason why we should think about it. And I think in our case, it's the experience that have made us to rethink about the issues within the labor market. And if we don't critically think about those issues, with the backdrop that within the labor market there are players, there are partners, there are interests, there's power dynamics, we will not be able to plan very well for the workforce to meet those needs that we should be meeting.
Yeah. So you said we were forced and we also wanted to rethink. So what are some of the things that were different through that thinking? What did you start to do differently? Maybe start in 2008, you know, after 2008. What did you develop as new ways of looking at the dynamics?
Okay, so, I mean, Liberia is a country that went through 14 years of conflict. And if I reflect back some of the conversations that we had in the last few days, there was migration of healthcare workers out of the country. There's also rural-urban migration occurring. Our training institutions were not up and running because of the crisis situation. Then coupled with that, there's a huge demand on the system, and then you go through an outbreak situation. So there was a need, firstly, to step back and really be able to ask ourselves, with the plans that we had thought about before, when things seem a bit normal, and with the experiences that we have encountered, what is it that within those plans that we need to think about differently? Do we actually understand what's happening in the private sector? I guess the perspective of private, public thinking around healthcare was one of those conversations that we started to have, that whatever you may be doing so well within the public sector, if there's not an understanding of the private sector, which in every case, the public and the private sector contributes to what you get in health, you may not be able to achieve that much. So that whole public-private was something that we did think about. We also had a conversation around, I mean, honestly, are we training the right people in the right numbers that we need? Do we need to rethink the way we train people? Do we need to rethink the way we deploy people? And all of those are the kind of things we've been thinking about based on our experiences.
So, in a way, I mean, of course, I know that these have been tough times, the times you describe, but did you think something positive came out of that thinking? I mean, good ideas, but in reality, could you actually also move processes?
Yeah, I think there's a lot that's been done in country as a result of those experiences. Starting from the production standpoint, we did not have a lot more training institutions as it was before. We've been able to build our training institutions, looking at different cadres of healthcare workers, but also how other private institutions have contributed to the production of the workforce that we have. We have thought critically about a problem that most of our African countries also confront with, and I think we heard it in previous section, that when you produce people, it's not an end in itself. It's about producing them, how do you recruit them, how do you retain them, how do you deploy them, and whether you have the right numbers for your service delivery model that you are implementing. So I think it's worked out. Liberia, for the first time, have trained specialists in country. And I think all of those things have come based on the experience that we have had, that we had to kind of take some bold steps, even if everything wasn't so ready to do so. Yeah.
I'm looking at Mr. Alkema because he's paying a lot of attention to what you're saying, and I saw him nod a few times. Now, in Europe, of course, there's also a discussion because the challenge is everywhere, different circumstances, but do you have a feeling that in Europe people are thinking critically enough and creatively enough, a little bit in line of what our Liberian colleagues are saying here, or should there be a more radical rethink in Europe as well?
I think we absolutely need radical rethinking of our
Sorry,
education
is the mic working?
structures.
I'm just testing. Can people hear Mr. Alkema or not? Yeah, okay.
Perhaps if I talk here, I think there is some critical rethinking. I'll give you one example. We train gastrointestinal medical specialists, and if you look at the training period from the start of the medical education until you're a gastrointestinal medical specialist, it takes 12 years. A couple of years ago in the Netherlands, the government decided to start a protocol on testing everyone that might be susceptible for gastrointestinal cancer. What happened was that we had a huge shortage of gastrointestinal medical specialists immediately because the program doesn't wait for 12 years for us to train the abundant and the sufficient amount of doctors. So what we're looking at now is already for several years in a row a deficit in sufficiently trained doctors. So what we are rethinking now is how can we make also the training of medical specialists more modular, more specialized first in a broader sense and then specialized in a certain direction and a top specialization in the end, so that you're not put into a silo from the very start of your medical training already, and that the only thing that you're looking for is a professional career in that one silo. And I think the creativity that we can learn from your experience is the future is not predictable, and training people with a career plan, with a training plan of 12 years ahead is not working anymore. So we have to rethink our education models to become more modular and more flexible to meet the future healthcare needs.
This is in the area of education, which we also touched upon this morning. And I think a lot of people will agree with you. Now, are there other domains where you feel, given the dynamics that has been sketched also by Oliver here, do you feel that we need to put the steps on a little bit on certain shifts in our thinking? There are all kinds of things happening. We heard this morning in side sessions a lot of wonderful things. But is it happening fast enough, energetically enough, coordinated enough? And where are these trends that we should really accelerate a little bit?
Well, one of the things, and it is related, and I'm not going to the area of training again, but we have created a set of professional silos, especially in OECD countries, that I think are limiting our flexibility. And it's not about training, but it's about creating more interaction between these professional silos and breaking down some of the walls of these silos, because healthcare delivery is a multi-professional, team-oriented setting. It's not just one specialization that takes care of someone who's sick. So this multi-professional perspective is something that we should really incorporate in the way in which we deliver healthcare and also in the way in which we think about healthcare delivery.
Debra, as chief nurse and seeing all this and also in the Australian perspective, are we thinking radically enough, given the challenge that is ahead of us, the gaps that are there, the labor market? Are we thinking creatively enough, or should there be shifts also, and are there shifts occurring in the thinking of your government, for instance?
I think that we have quite a considerable challenge around getting the professions at times working together better in more team-based models and utilising the relevant elements of their practice to the greatest advantage. I think also on the issue of specialisation that certainly both, I would say, in medicine and nursing, there's a recognition in our country that we need to actually pull back in a way to more generalist models, and a recent appointment's been of a Rural Health Commissioner who's one of his key roles will be about, in our rural areas, looking at how we get more generalist pathways. So, because that's more the sort of health professional that we need. So I think that there is a role for those things, but we've probably need to reconsider how they fit within the various ways care gets delivered. And also looking at who can take on roles. Australia's had a similar issue with an introduction of screening around bowel cancer, and then who's going to do all the tests. And so we've got a small number of models now where you've got nurse endoscopists who can do that in conjunction with and working with a gastroenterologist, so that you're utilising the expert skills where you need them, and having someone else who can do other aspects who have a different set of skills, but they can come together. And I think we need to continue to do that sort of work and think about how we can shift the various models of care and the way we deliver care, because we obviously can't continue to do it the way we are.
Oliver, you're listening to this with great attention from the ILO perspective, because you've actually, you look in a lot of countries, you look in a lot of settings, a lot of diversity, a lot of dimensions on the labour market, but you're listening to our colleagues here. You feel what people suggest will do the job?
Well, I mean, these are very interesting ideas, but they tend to be a bit focused on sort of higher-end medical professionals, and it's still very much a professional route. I think here at ILO, we tend to see a wider picture, which is, of course, that healthcare represents a growing part of the economy. Where we live now in a greener environment where commodity and industrial production is going to perhaps decline, and services are really going to be in demand. So we have to look at the very complex areas of workers that you have. You have, of course, high-end specialists, doctors that need 12 years of training, but you also have the elderly care, the infant care, and so forth, where you have pathways for migrant workers, you have pathways for young workers, for people coming from more informal settings to enter the labor market. So from our...
Can I ask you something here? I mean, do you feel that the health arena, the health people, are benefiting enough from the knowledge that is there? I mean, I had one ILO colleague who told me just the other day, he said, you know, the good news is that the health sector is actually be one of the major employment drivers. It can be. So guys, shape up, you know. He was telling me, he said, shape up, because, you know, in the health sector, this is one of the few real booming areas. Let's do something.
Yeah, I mean,
so do you feel health people embrace this more optimistic, we can do something enough?
Well, I mean, I think one of the key takeaways is that the health people should be talking to the labor people as well. Because probably not as much, or at least the health people needs to get the capacity to have the same, be on the same wavelength.
Give us one or two concrete examples where they do, because I think we're also here because we want to start to interconnect in smarter ways. So there's a lot of expertise also in this hall. And what I always am struck by as an old mama is that when I talk to three people and they start to talk to each other and they have all a lot of knowledge, and the four of them know much more together, but sometimes they're in the same building and they never talk to each other. Now, ILO is like 2 blocks away from the WHO, so we're all in the global arena, you're very close by. Do people talk enough, and where do they talk?
Well, I think they're starting to, and I think this conversation is going to be a very exciting one. We just had a meeting a few days ago with the Labour Minister of Côte d'Ivoire, who, as you probably know, is leading efforts in West Africa to invest deeply, not only in healthcare, but in other public service areas like education. And the idea there is to go against a bit the kind of austerity ideas of the World Bank and other financial institutions, to say it's okay to go a bit deeper into debt and to use public finance to fund these positions.
Any World Bank people in the room?
Sorry.
Okay.
It's okay.
Deeper into that.
We talk a lot with them as well, so it's all right. No, but the idea is that these are not expenditures. These are not public wage bills. These are investments. These are investments not only in achieving SDGs, better health outcomes or education outcomes, but they are also investments in creating potentially a growing middle class, good, stable, skilled jobs that not only create a better supply, but their own demand. And on top of that, you get ancillary services, the cleaners, the medical technicians, the carers, and so forth that come along with that. It's a very interesting strategy. It's a very ambitious strategy, but it shows that where these two ideas link, you can have some powerful ideas, and then we understand that the South African development community is looking at this with great interest as well, so that's inspiring.
Okay, so there are forums, arenas, where people are actually talking, and out of this dialogue comes new energy. Now, I want to see in the hall, who says, I'm in that arena, I'm in that space where, you know, as a health person, I talk to ILO people or people in the more labor market general arena. Who says, I'm in that dialogue already, we're doing things already. I want to see hands of people who say, we're already in that creative space of dialogue. Can I see hands? So health people who say, I've been, yeah, well, there's one person there.
There's one up there.
The people who, can they stand up? Say, we're actually already in that arena. You are there. I'm going to come to you in the round of, because I want to hear, this is the creative interconnectivity we're looking for. So, because if people stay in the silos, like Mr. Alkema is saying, you know, you do a lot of good things, but maybe not enough. So, now back to our friend from Liberia. I'm actually very, very interested how that story progressed. So you had your initial, let's say the initial war period. After the war, you started to, so in what steps, in more concrete steps, what did you actually do to sort of build things gradually?
Well, so I think the first thing I should mention is some of the kind of labor market failures that we had, because it's only with identifying those failures within the labor market that you're able to really think through policies and then be able to plan. So from the production standpoint that I started with, over the years, we did train health workers. A bulk of our co-health worker at mid-level cadres, so where you have the midwives, the nurses, physician assistants, and the doctors. The highest number of health workers we have are actually nurses. But if you look back, Liberia is a country that is battling maternal mortality issues. And I usually give this story on the basis of my own training. When I trained as a nurse a few years back, most of my colleagues that entered into the midwifery program were older women, because it was seen as that was a profession for older women. Why am I saying this? If I look back about 16 years back, we have a huge shortage of midwives. So if you think about what's happening right now is how, from a production standpoint, the folks that you train, the cadre you train, actually meets up with your workforce needs. It actually matches with your service delivery model as a starting point. So we realized that, yes, we were training health workers because we had shortage. It's probably we did not do so well with being able to match the different skill sets that we needed. That's one instance. And so we've looked at, now that you have a huge pool of nurses, how can you give them additional skills, or how could they take all other professional cadres? So say, for example, the issue of mental health is key. We now have mental health clinicians that have been trained, but they are actually nurses or physician assistants that have taken on other roles and responsibilities. We have midwives that are now become registered midwives. Initially, it was just like a diploma program in that, and we've moved to that. That's one side on the production side. But most importantly, and I think it came out in some of the other conversations, is that now that we have trained people that we need, they might not be in the right numbers that we have. Employment. We train people, they enter the workforce. We have a huge situation right now where, the number is 35% right now of our current public sector workforce that are not civil servants. So you have a whole pool of people within the workforce that really depends on other sources of funding. So it's like you have an employment, but you don't have a status. Because of that, you also find a shift from the public sector into other places where people can find jobs. So some of the investment you have made actually on the production fund, you are not reaping it for service delivery because people are moving either abroad
So in answer to that particular challenge, because we've heard this also in side events, we've heard a lot of people struggling with this. You educate people, you educate them better. Now they're fully educated, and they flood the market, but there's no jobs or there's no possibilities for advancement. And they go to greener pastures, or they leave the country, or they do something else. So in answer to that challenge, what do you think the routing should be to sort of face that?
Yeah, so I think it's the Minister of Health from Uganda said, or even Mozambique. Firstly, you need money. It's obvious. So a practical example from our end was, at a certain point in time, there were budgetary allocation to a certain degree roll health workers onto civil service payroll. But the bigger question for me is, when a government invests into training of healthcare workers, within our context, there is a notion that if you have invested into training healthcare workers, the public sector should absorb all of them. We've realized over the years that it's not practical, and I think that's where the labor market dynamics come in. When we produce health workers, they are both for public and private sector. So it's clear in our mind that the public sector may not be able to absorb adequately all of the healthcare workers that are trained. What that will also mean is that you have to rethink your arrangement of should everyone become civil servants. Is it practical for everyone to become civil servants?
Can I turn to your neighbor here? Because I know that Mr. Alkema, he comes from my own home country. And strangely enough, in the Netherlands, there's no public institution as such anymore. All the health institutions are private. In some cases, not for profit, but they're private foundations. So there is nobody's on a civil service payroll in the Dutch healthcare system, except for the few people that work for the ministry. But a lot of people. So if you listen to our colleague from Liberia, how she says we cannot keep doing this all on the public ticket. We need to somehow. How would you respond to that from the perspective of some European countries where the opposite is the case?
Well, in my organization, my European organization, we have both members from countries where the health sector is completely publicly financed and publicly organized. We have countries where the health sector is publicly financed and privately organized, and we have countries where the health sector is also predominantly privately financed and organized. I think it doesn't really matter if people are a civil servant or not. Financing is key. And as an economist, I know that in the end, you get what you pay for. So if the budget, whether budget in private or public, goes in one direction, the delivery of services will go with it. And I feel that, in a sense, gaining experience also from private provision of health services can be beneficial also to countries where health services are mostly publicly financed and publicly organized, because I do feel that, and I have that experience from my own country, from the Netherlands, that if you're in a very budgetary setting, then you tend to spend the budget. And if it's abundant, then you spend the abundant budget, and if it's tight, then you spend the tight budget. But it doesn't mean that we're always efficiently providing the healthcare that's needed by the patients. And therefore, I think that the private perspective can help us to change the focus from who's providing the budget to who's demanding proper healthcare. And I think we should look in, and this is what healthcare systems are also going into, outcome-oriented healthcare and also financing of outcome-oriented healthcare provision. And I think there the private perspective is going to be absolutely helpful also to manage some of the budgetary restraints that we will also be looking into.
I'm asking the same question to Debra. So if you listen to our Liberian colleague, how, from an Australian perspective, you also probably would not say everything has to be on the ticket of the public services.
No.
So how do you deal with her big challenge, because it's a big challenge? And how do you deal with the challenge that was leading to her answer, that a lot of people get trained, might even be better trained, and then somehow the employment arena is not such that these people get proper employment? How do you deal in Australia with such challenges?
Well, of course, the Australian system is a mix of private and public, and but there is still a perception, I suppose, that when you graduate, you get a job in the public system now. We do have some differences with the different professions, but and we have had some issues about employing particularly newly graduating nurses in some of our states. And there is certainly a lot more work now occurring with the private providers, but also with general practice, primary healthcare settings, looking at getting graduates of programs into the full range of areas that healthcare gets delivered, rather than what has largely been a focus on you finish your degree and you've got to get to work in a public hospital. That this really is not necessary, and that there are lots of other settings where you can get perfectly good experience and further develop your skills and capabilities that are not dependent upon being in a hospital. So there's quite a bit of work happening around our different states and territories as to how they can facilitate that. Now, that is largely facilitated by the state government, by the public sector, so to speak, but working with the other sectors.
Oliver, listening to this particular challenge that a lot of countries are facing. So now they might have overcome the educational gap a little, so people are more and more and better trained, but then the job arena is still not optimal. So from your ILO perspective, what is your thinking? I mean, where are good examples, good practices of how you could overcome maybe some of these problems?
Well, it's a big challenge because, of course, there's a certain wage ceiling. I mean, you're not they're not sports performers or whatever that are going to be paid exorbitant wages. There is, of course, enormous space for private services, but there are also enormous risks there, equity being one of them. And I think that's where this outcome-based health planning is a bit, yeah, we have to be careful with it. The idea is not to invest only in hospitals that have high rates of curing people, because that might be in urban places where people are demanding much earlier and have healthier lifestyles and so forth. One of the things we know is that, for example, in rural settings, something like over 50% of the population doesn't have access to health services, precisely because there are not enough health workers. And this is not, this means that the demand itself is also not a stable thing. These are people who will not even demand health services because it's not something that they even envisage they can ask for. So if we take a purely, again, market-based approach to these things, these are the populations that are going to be underserviced. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone has to become a bureaucrat and a civil servant to supply this. But I think there are certain things that go along with the civil servant status that are associated with the kind of prestige that it takes to encourage people to work in these settings, and that is employment stability. It's one thing to have a permanent civil servant contract, but to have at least open-ended contracts, so you're not being hired for short-term deployments and so forth, which makes jobs unattractive. Wages is an issue, but it's not only wages, it's the social benefits, the social protection that goes with it. It is the protection, because if you have, for example, maternity issues or other work-life balance issues that go along with it, that I think make that civil servant or civil servant-like status attractive and important to maintain a certain stability in this important workforce.
So if I could do, sorry, did I hear? Somehow I heard some voice, but maybe it's a higher spirit. This hall is actually of 1731, so there's all kinds of ghosts hovering over our gatherings here. It was a friendly society in its origin, which is very interesting. So these were people in the 18th century also wanted to improve on life and life conditions of ordinary people. So we're in good spirits here. What I wanted to ask you before I got called by hire, I'm very intrigued because what we've heard so far is Oliver saying the labor market optimization in healthcare is part of the larger national thinking about labor market optimization. I heard a lot of people give examples of how this dynamic is actually going very fast. There might be trends currently underway that, while we're thinking, the realities around us might have already changed. There's technological advances of different sorts. At the same time, we face a lot of very persistent issues. The issue of rural that was mentioned in the hall also this morning. Disadvantaged areas where, ever since even in history books, you see it's always been a challenge. How do you get good services to populations in those places? And the labor market there, how is that functioning? The retention issue, I think it's everywhere, it's a problem. It's a shared thing with, of course, local specifics. I wanted to treat two of those. So first, the dynamics of what is already happening around us, like aging societies, for instance. The care economy is rapidly changing. So I'm looking now at, because I know, Debra, this is very much also some of your concern at the moment. Seen from the perspective of that type of dynamics, what will that do to labor market and what opportunities might there maybe be there, given the fact that the health market is widening to a broader care market as well. So could you say a little bit of how the thinking goes in Australia on that topic?
Certainly there is a significant growth in the health and what some would call social care. There have been some significant policy changes in Australia which are seeing an increase in demand for care workers and how that intersects with health care. Because we're looking to get the same people into a variety of different roles. So we're really at a beginning stage of looking at how some of those intersections occur. How do we actually have a workforce that has a broad range of skills that enables them to work across those different sectors, recognising that we have both an ageing population and an ageing workforce, but also a lot of younger people looking for work, so that there are opportunities for different sorts of models and ways of organising care, and that the great role community plays in social care in particular. Certainly our focus is very much with aged care and social care, and like we've got a large disability scheme now, that this occurs all in the home. So you have to have care workers with an appropriate set of skills, but who can also work with the significant others, family members, that are also providing the care. So that it is about, I suppose, a different set of relationships between the organisations that provide the care and those that deliver it, and the people receiving it and the other members of their family. The other big shift in the age and disability sector is that the funding for the care sits with the consumer. So the consumer gets to say, I want you to provide my care and this is what I want from it, rather than a provider saying, I've got these 20 options and yes, you might be able to pick one. So it's quite a significant challenge for organisations to change their approach to the consumer of health and social care in terms of what they deliver and how they deliver it. And that, again, impacts on the sort of worker that you might need, because they have to be able to function in a slightly different way as well.
So you touch on 3 or 4 things at once. First of all, that for an ageing workforce, there might also be new opportunities. At the same time, it suggests that for younger people, some of that work might not be so attractive, because why otherwise would they not be there? Yeah. So there is an issue about how do we actually attract youth? How is the work sphere going to be attractive to young people? So I would like to ask Mr. Alkema, because in your hospital arena in Europe, I think there's probably also a lot of thinking about that. You mentioned earlier that there is a shift also from hospitals to much more domestic type care provision. Now, in that space, so the extramural, as we call it, extramural care, do you see interesting opportunities that might actually boost the labor market, for instance, for young people, but also for people who are slightly older, more senior in the workforce?
Well, that's a very complex question. If this shift would boost labor market opportunities, I think what is required from future health professionals is a different perspective on delivering of healthcare. And I'll give you one example. Especially in the hospital setting, we are very much oriented at following protocol and intervening, doing interventions, treating patients, and sending them out of the hospital. And an average in OECD countries, I think, the average time spent in a hospital is between 5 and 6 days, and then they go home and something has to be taken care of there. What's increasingly becoming more standard is that you talk to a patient if he or she wants the intervention, and if that's going to provide the patient with more quality of care. And if you consider the fact that 80% of all cost of healthcare takes place in the final 2 years of a human's life, then the discussion on what kind of interventions are useful and what kind of healthcare delivery you need is crucial. The only problem is you never know when these final 2 years are starting. So this requires...
We're starting now.
They might be. I might stumble when I go out and break my neck, and then that would be cheap for the health sector. The thing is, it would require a different set of skills from medical professionals and healthcare professionals, because you need to be trained more in communicating with patients and showing potential opportunities instead of following protocol and doing your intervention that you were trained for technically to do. Hopefully you're very good at it, but it's not always the best care if you look at quality of life for the patient. So it does mean that people that are interested in this patient-oriented perspective on delivering of healthcare, they might be far more interested. And this also relates to topics like, do we get people interested in provision of healthcare in rural areas? Because the technical specialities will not be so easily available in rural areas, but this perspective of relating far more to the need of the patient is a specific issue that is obviously on the table in rural areas as it is in urban areas. So it requires a different perspective from future health workers than what we have been doing for the past decades, like making people more and more technically specialized in doing the intervention that in the end might not always be the best for the quality of care of the patient.
Thanks for that answer. I'm suddenly thinking of my husband. I hope you don't mind.
He's not in his final 2 years, I hope.
No, I definitely hope he's not. He's not a health person at all, and he always tells me, he said, well, why do people not focus more generally on just living, living, not only healthy living, but just conditions of life, peace of mind, general sense of security, etc. So the broader context that make human beings feel well. And why do they not invest more, he'd ask me as a healthcare person, in giving people that sort of basic stability, basic peace of mind, a little bit of healthy exercise or whatever. He's not a fanatic American in exercise, but he's healthy because he has this basic sort of soul. Now I'm looking at Oliver because you were also talking about the broader perspective. I'm very much interested in the 40 million, which is becoming almost like a holy figure. And a lot of bright minds have made that up, so I'm not denying the evidence underneath it. But does it factor in enough that life might also change, and that we might maybe have to introduce or reintroduce some basic factors of living. So not so health, but so to what extent is the 40 million based on straight extrapolation, and to what extent is it based on some of the shifts that might be occurring in humanity, because they say enough is enough, we're going to live slightly differently.
You told us in the briefing you were going to ask easy questions. So
This is an easy one for somebody who studied at the ILO for so long. No. I know you can answer this one, so I'm with faith answer.
My colleague Christiane Wisco is here. I said it's after lunch, so you should say some controversial things. So this is a prompt, I guess. No, of course. I mean, I think. Sorry, is that me?
This was the bomb attack that we had earlier also. There's not a fire alarm, there's something in the sound system. Maybe it's because I crossed my legs. I am not supposed to do that. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, of course. I think things are going to change very, very drastically in the next 30 years.
It's your mic.
That's me?
Yeah.
No, it's not working.
Can I try this one? Okay, maybe that was the ILO sensor. No, I mean, we call the aging economy, we have a wonderful euphemism for the silver economy. It's this growing demand that's coming from the aging population. But I think, yeah, of course, our approach to labor standards is, for one thing, that is about creating general well-being for the population. One of the greatest victories of neoliberalism, I should say, is that it has been so internalized by all of us in this quest for productivity, in this quest for maximum productivity of working populations. Yesterday I was at a discussion about climate change, and one of the greatest fears is that the increasing heat wave is going to reduce the hours workers can be productive, as if that was the prime concern in this question. And so I think an international labor standards approach, which is what the ILO promotes, is about saying, look, we all have to be productive, but we as a society can agree that there are limits to this. And we've seen this throughout history. I mean, you have days of rest and so forth. This is simply humans agreeing that there must be space for also social well-being. So that's one thing. I think there are other things that we need to anticipate, of course, is what the values are going to be of the younger generation. All this discussion is focused really on one group, that is the millennials, who we are training today, that we hope will take care of us in our final 2 years. And one of the things we've seen across many sectors, of course, is that, and this is, I think, very much to the discussion we've heard from you in Liberia, is that the nation state is no longer the prime organizer of anything. Mm-hmm. It is now diffracted so that we are depending on migration to replace these worker gaps. Something like 30% in the UK, for example, are already foreign-born who are working as doctors. This is so. This is no longer caring about your own community, it's the outsourcing of caring that's going on, the outsourcing of emotional work. You have the fact that work is no longer going to be a major part of our life. Retirement and training are going to become greater parts of our lives. So the identity is very different as well. I think these are things we're going to have to grapple with. How do you get people to work in these sectors, such as teaching, such as care, that are seen as work that is losing in status, that is seen as, sorry to say it, as women's work because of the high feminization you have in these sectors, that is seen as work that should be performed by migrant workers or people who need to be imported, and get the quality that we want. These are challenges. These are enormous challenges, and a lot of it has to do with how we, what kind of values we create about caring and consumption in our society. And I think that's the other area where education has a role to play. The point of education is not just to prepare youth to survive in a new world of work, but it's also to have the human skills, the solidarity, to get back to the kind of society, the economy, the labor market that we want, not that is being imposed or determined for us.
Okay, well, I asked you a simple question and you gave a very sort of simple answer. Because immediately we got the gender issue on the table, we got the migration issue on the table. For some of you who were here already on Monday, there's been a fantastic discussion going on in this conference already on the challenges of the migration, and we'll come back to this in the plenary on governance. But there are a lot of people in this room who are very passionate about we need a global conversation about migration, because somebody's push is somebody else's pull, or somebody's pull is somebody else's loss. So we have to really talk about this, and there are codes, of course, the global codes that a lot of people signed on to, but I think they need to be further elaborated and enhanced in the dynamic that we have been discussing. Now, I'm going to leave these four speakers a little bit of room, and I'm going to come to you in a minute. I'm first going to go to the lady, the labor market expert, because I think I want to hear her view so far. Then I'm going to go to the gentleman there who said he is in the interconnecting space between health and labor markets. And I'm going to come to the gentleman here who also said that he was in that same space. 2 people out of an audience of 500. I think we need to attract more people there. And then I'm going to come to all of you. So we have this panel is still about 3 o'clock. So I'll do a sort of 10 minutes of questions, comments, starting with these 3. You can recover and then you get the final round. Is that okay? We'll do it this way. I'll take this exit for a change, you know, just to be different. After the remarks about breaking your neck, I don't want to break my neck before this conference is up. So we'll start with the labor market expert and the gentleman there. First the 3 I promised, and then the rest. Is that okay? So far, okay?
Thank you very much to all the participants. I think all of your comments and experiences have been valuable. And also, you know, the call to have more health people and labor market people speak with each other. I'm here to talk, if you want to chat. I think one of the things that, and I am, you know, I said I wasn't a health person, but I'm sort of entering more into this field day by day, learning a lot from this conference and from all of you. I think one of the challenges we really need to talk about is, you know, the gentleman from the ILO spoke about the future of work, how work won't be as big of a part of our lives, and the really sort of immediate challenges that everybody else in this room is working on today. So how are we balancing the need to focus on the short and medium term with our limited budgets, but also to be planning for the future? I think that's a huge challenge. How can we work on both levels? So I would say that that's my major reaction coming out of this.
How to balance the dynamics for the more distant future with the immediate concerns today, especially since things are changing so rapidly. I have to do a little anecdote, 1 second. I was watching a film in my country just the other day. It was a film, a Dutch documentary maker film of 1998. Some of you might remember that glorious year, 1998, 20 years ago. And this film was about young people at that time being the proud owners of the first Nokia telephone. Some of us older people might remember that one, the big Nokia. It's now in the museum. So,
Yeah, I guess that's the missing link, though.
the film was shown to us to remind us how quick things change. So the young people at that time that were in the documentary, 1991, were asked how they liked this new token. And then they were told, in 10 years from now, you might actually be able to see a film on that telephone. Whereupon, a lot of the young people started laughing at this documentary maker, saying, no, I go to the cinema for movies, you know, and I would never know, watching films on my phone, this is totally ridiculous. 1998. So now we're talking about 2030, similar sort of time frame. Do we know, do we have any sense how laughable we might be today to people who watch us? Anyway, this is just something that crossed my mind. I want to come to you, but it's a little hard. So can we meet midway? Maybe because I want to hold the mic. I'll hold the mic. Is that okay? This is my control nature of. All right. The bridge. This is Mr. Conferido. I actually heard him yesterday. He's my favorite gentleman from Philippines. Can I give already an applause to this gentleman because he's going to say something fantastic? I know already.
I hope I don't disappoint you. But again, I'm the odd person in the room, so with apologies to the experts, I don't mean to be impolite, but when you complicate things a lot more, I don't think people will understand. The genius chess player Bobby Fischer said, if things are so complicated and you are losing the game, the best thing to do is to simplify. And if things are so simple and you are losing, complicate. That's how you approach things. First things first. The need is still the mother of all inventions and adjustments. If you cannot define the need, then you will not be able to address anything. You don't begin with the solution, you begin with the right question. If you don't ask the right question, you're not going to get the right answer. And again, I apologize. The Philippines was one of the earliest constituent of the ILO to be persuaded to adopt employment planning. I wonder whether the ILO expert will affirm this. But you know what our experience was? We did employment planning, if I'm not mistaken, since 1983. Many of you have not been born yet at that time. And if I may remind you, personal computer got accessible to the public only in 1975. And again, you will not remember it, it's dinosaurs history. But the result of our employment planning was every projection that we did based on macroeconomic assumptions were way off what actually emerged from the labor market situation. So what did it tell us? It told us that we must admit that we are human beings. We are not capable of predicting everything. And even as we respond to assumptions, the assumptions themselves do change. So the lawyers are saying, do not assume, because when you assume, you make an ass out of you and me. So what have we done? From labor market or employment planning, we started working on labor market information. What we need are signals. That's why artificial intelligence is emerging to be more intelligent than human beings, because they're composed of all sensors. In our case, we have only 2 eyes, 2 ears, and 1 big mouth, and 1 nosy nose. So that's a very limited number of sensors. But if we have a lot of sensors and we are understanding the needs of the various sectors, and if we just put out those signals, then human beings are rationals and will be able to adjust them. So I'll invite you, again, we are not perfect, please visit phil.job.net. That's the labor market information system of the Department of Labor and Employment of the Philippines, phil.job.net. And we are partnering with private sector information providers like JobStreet, JobsDB, and these are the ones that are enabling our people to adjust. I think I suggested the last 2 days. If you want to learn anything, learn from the systems that work, not from the broken system. So maybe you should try this and improve on it. And I bet we will emerge with something productive and we will be able to transform the labor market, not in a controlled authoritarian way, but in a democratic way where people are empowered to make rational decisions themselves. The biggest elephant in the room is shortage of health workers, human resource in health workers. So you don't learn from economies that have shortage of health workers. You learn from the Philippines where we have an excess supply of health workers. And if you allow the market to work, we can help you address your health worker shortage. Thank you.
it's always very dangerous to give the microphone to my Philippine colleague. But no, you made a very, very pertinent observations, and the website, I think we will reiterate so that people can visit them. I'm going to go there first, and then I'll do the rounds. There was one other gentleman here who said that he was in the interface between labor market, health labor market people and general labor market people.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I'm Pascal from the World Health Organization. And first, to respond to one of the Godleaf questions asking where ILO and WHO meet, where does it taking place? So I can tell you the answer. Most of the time is at the cafeteria. And it's the ILO cafeteria. And then don't quote me, but the ILO cafeteria is better than the WHO cafeteria. So that's about the migration of people from WHO to ILO. I would like first to congratulate all the panelists. I think it was very interesting to hear the different perspectives, and really, for me, you highlighted all the key health labor market issues. And I really think that, as it was mentioned, it's on the one hand, it's a complex issue, but what is even more complex is to simplify a complex issue. But I think it's very important for this to understand the health labor market, and I think this will allow also to do better planning. For sure, planning is a very risky exercise. As an economist, we say an economist is someone who will tell you tomorrow what he planned for yesterday did not happen today. So it's a risky exercise, and we know it, but still, the health labor market is a very special market compared to others, and those specificities has to be taken into account. And I think the panelists highlighted that very well. One of the things, it takes a long time to train a medical doctor. You cannot have a medical doctor in 1 year. It takes a long time. You have also other issues of you dealing with health. And as one of the panelists mentions, health is something very important. We want and we like to define in terms of the needs, how many health workers you would need to attain the highest level of health. And for this, it makes the health labor market a very special market as well. And when we talk about health labor market, it's not to leave it to the market. It's sometimes because of the market failure that one of the panelists mentions, that requires an intervention of the state in order to reach a higher level possible of health for the people. So I think those are something very important, some of the important points. And as a labor market, what is also important is that the health labor market is influenced by the overall labor market. There's not even one health labor market. It's fragmented in different ones. The labor market for doctors, nurses, allied health workers is different. It's not the same in a way, although we can approach it from an overall approach. At the same time, we need to have a good understanding of the overall health labor market. And the last point that was also mentioned, and I think this is very important, is how important is the health workforce in the overall employment. And in OECD, it was found that about 12% of the workforce is the health workforce. And it's growing in many countries. And it's about job creation and also contributing to economic inclusive growth. And that's a dimension that is important to promote through the labor market as well. So those were some of the points I wanted to highlight. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. I'm going to take a few questions. Maybe I saw one gentleman here, lady here. Okay, and a lady there, yeah? If you can make it a little bit to the side of the row, I can reach to you, and I'll stay here. This is Dr. Marilyn De Luca.
Thank you. I really have more of a comment, and I guess my comment is really about, we're talking about labor markets, and I think we need to keep in mind that health is not a typical market. Consumers, patients, whatever we call them, are in a very unfair position. They don't purchase health care like they do another commodity. They have an uneven relationship with the provider. So when we talk about demand. I think what we really need to talk about is the employer demand, and that very much depends on how much those payers are going to invest. So when we talk about there not being the demand, it's been a suppression of that demand because either governments or insurers won't pay. Does not reflect the need that the patients, the population has that are both needs and demands. So I think we need to be mindful of that distinction when we talk about this market.
Thank you very much for that reminder. I think a lot of people in the room will agree with you that also demand is complex. We know the supply-driven demand that might also exist. So how do we get to the real priorities of people, the real needs of people? I saw a gentleman here. He was, and then the lady there. I'm afraid I'm not going to give the microphone anymore to anybody. So I'm going to stand closer to you, if I can pass here, and I'll hold the mic.
Thank you. I'm Baba Aye from the PSI. I think to a great extent, the panelists have looked at the labor market from the demand and supply angle. I think we also need to look at flexibilization and deregulation of the labor market. The health sector had, to a great extent, been kind of ensconced from this, but under the waves of austerity measures in the wake of the economic crisis, this is a major issue that has to be addressed. And also relatedly, in looking at the labor market, I'm happy the other person pointed out, although for different reasons, that the labor market is not your typical market, so to speak. It's also important to point out that the labor market in the health sector, we're talking about human beings, workers that belong to unions and should be part of concerted social dialogue at improving employment and working conditions in the sector. And I think that should be underlined, for example, talking about Liberia. I think that there are huge deficits of that, which is reflected also in how the National Health Workers Union of Liberia, is being addressed in this matter, and bridging these gaps would be to the overall interest of the health system in that country, and I think this is something that could be generalized as well.
Fantastic. I think we have very nice, strong reminders. Also keep your comment as a reminder, the reminder that there's a much broader social dialogue here and a much broader social context in which some of these labor market discussions take place, given austerity crisis, all this. So thank you for that. I'm moving to the final speaker. If we can meet halfway, if we can start walking. In the meantime, I'm already giving the question to the panel. One of the basic questions that came up is how do you match urgent needs of today with the proper future-oriented thinking? You were forced to do that, think ahead a little bit, but how do you prevent from not getting bogged down in today's concerns and then forget that the world is rapidly changing around it? Yeah, so I think that will be the final question for you, but go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. I'm Marcel Claquin from Mozambique. I would like also to bring a new perspective that actually came from all of your comments, the five of you. The more you were talking, the more I was reflecting about more workforce for prevention. Like Gottlieb said, we need to focus about being healthy. And that shortage, I'm afraid we will never be able to get all the health workers we want unless we have more healthy people. So, for example, we may focus more about prevention activities. And for example, the role of yoga as a therapy has been proven more and more in the scientific paper to prevent many diseases. I think this is where we need to focus on how we can get people healthy and empower people to know their body and know how to be healthy and to keep the body healthy. Thank you.
Thanks. Now, she reminded me of something. Yeah, an applause is good, and actually, let's applaud all of us, because I read in a paper just the other day that laughing and applauding first of all, prevents you from getting Alzheimer. This is great literature, but I like this kind of great literature. So a warm applause. And I would say, let's do it this. I have a lot of African friends in this audience. Let's do the African rain clap. You know the rain clap, huh? Let's do the rain clap. The rain clap is as follows. We'll do it again for the panel in a minute because this was a weak rehearsal, but it's also, you know, the Irish rain is much stronger than this one. But final question, I'm not even going to come up there anymore. Final question to you, and I'll start again with our friend from Liberia. Some concerns in the room about, there's all kinds of things that are pressing, urgent things of today, but what we're talking about here is, you know, also be future-oriented enough. Now, where does that ring a bell with you? I mean, where do you feel this rings with me? Where do you feel your efforts go to the future, and where are you bogged down in day-to-day?
Yeah, I guess from our context, a really key priority is for service delivery, ensuring that the population have some essential healthcare services. But we also recognize the fact that you cannot have basic essential healthcare services without a health worker. So I guess in the next few years, it's going to be really looking at the workforce. What other additional skills could you give your, really practically looking at your existing workforce. I guess over the last few days, we've heard that we will have a gap of healthcare workers. So the ones that you have within your employees, what are those things that you are able to do for them to ensure that you get the best productivity and to make sure the services, you actually read the outcome of services, as well as looking at the demographics is going to change, your disease burden is likely to change. You must be able to build up a workforce that will be able to match that need for the future. So to do that will require a lot of prioritization of what needs to come first. At the same time, so really, policies around that. I know we haven't spoken quite a lot about decisions that countries would have to make as to what do I prioritize first, what's going to be the policy around it, and what is the give and take. Because there might be some unforeseen consequences in the future. It's those hard questions that countries will have to battle with.
Thank you so much. I'm going to do ladies first now. So Debra, same question to you. I mean, how do you balance short-term concerns with long-term vision?
Is that working? I think that that can be challenging, but you need to do both, and it is often, or at times, that you get an opportunity that in dealing with a critical or a crisis situation, you have opportunities to actually start to deliver on your longer-term vision, because the crisis lets you do things that might have taken longer at other times. It's a balance, and you have to, I suppose, decide how critical the crisis is, because sometimes the things we think are a crisis are maybe not quite the crisis we think. And I think, picking up on a point that one of the members of the audience made, that for me, one of the other elements of the health workers that we have, what they do, and that is that engagement with the community, because while health workers themselves may place strictures around what they think they can and can't do, community also has certain expectations of health services, and as we are trying to change the way those services operate, they need to be part of that shift and change as well. Otherwise, it will take us a lot longer to get to where we need to be.
Thank you for that. I'm moving now to Mr. Alkema. Same question to you. I mean, seen from your European experience, but where do you feel we should have a better match between things that bog us down on a day-to-day basis and a future vision?
Well, I was thinking, with all these very important reflections also from the room, someone who's born today is very likely to live more than 100 years now. At least life expectancy in many OECD countries is going up rapidly, and also in non-OECD countries, life expectancy is going up rapidly. If we want to be able to provide proper care, then prevention is crucial. And prevention is not something that we're currently doing in the health sector. And this is, I think, a major issue for governments. We're spending, I think, 90 billion euros in health in the Netherlands. It's a very tiny country. And we spend something like 10, 15 million euros per year on prevention of disease. I think we need to have a dramatic shift between these two. That's something that we can already do today to keep these 100+ people from the future from not having to demand so much healthcare. And I think the reflection to current needs is health workers are also health consumers. So we should also look very carefully after our current health staff. And this is not just for retention, but it's also because if we don't create the safest and healthiest workplaces, we won't be able to keep them in the developed workforce, and that's far more costly than training a new person. So here I think is a link between our current need and our future demand. Be careful with the people that we currently have. Invest in safe workplaces. That's far more important than financial remuneration. It's important that people earn a decent salary, but it's far more important that they can work in safe work environments. And that's, I think, my plea for today.
I can only enhance that, ladies and gentlemen, tomorrow morning, our morning panel will be very much about decent work, and that will treat exactly these topics, the decent work agenda. Plus, it will deal also with health as a human right. We saw in the Twitter storm that we had yesterday evening that some people thought when we utter the word investment, we mean only pecunia, money, but actually by investment we mean all the possible sorts of investments also in people, very much in people. And so tomorrow the main panel will be on decent work. That will be embracing this. Final comment from the ILO. I thought, as health people, we give the ILO the final. Yeah, before the explosions started.
Don't want to cause. Well, thank you. And maybe I would just conclude by responding to Pascal. It's true that ILO and WHO meet in the cafeteria, but in addition to that, we've developed, of course, a very interesting program together with OECD called the Working for Health Initiative, which will focus on some of these solutions to anticipate future healthcare needs. So this initiative, which hopefully will be deployed in many, many countries, will provide an opportunity for the constituents, so for trade unions and employer associations and governments, of course, and other stakeholders to discuss how to develop health workforce plans in conjunction with employment policy plans, how to set up the labor market information systems that the gentleman from the Philippines pointed out are essential to manage these processes, health workforce accounts, but also information systems on health migration, to set up social dialogue institutions so that the very people affected by these policies will have a voice in these policies. It's not just to demand their rights, but it's also to bring in their knowledge and their understanding of the situation, which can inform the situation, the policies. And of course, training and skills as well. So you'll hear more about that tomorrow from my colleague Christophe Perrin. But we hope that everyone here in this room can get engaged in this initiative, and we're very excited about it.
Okay, now we're doing the serious version of the rain clap for this fantastic panel, and all of you for yourselves. So we start with one finger. Thank you very much. I think it's coffee break, tea break? Tea break. Oh yeah.